Hello, I am Larry Samuel. It's great to be here. And tonight I'm going to talk about Tudor City, where I have one of the smallest apartments, I'm sure, in Manhattan. I live there part of the time. But there's a great story attached to it. When I bought the place, I did a little research and I discovered there was a great story to be told that had not been told. So decided to write a book about it, which I did. And this is the result. So tonight I'm going to basically walk through the book in presentation form, which goes chronologically. And the five sort of sections are what I call City Within a City, which was the development of Tudor City, how it came to be in the late 1920s. And then I'll walk through the Depression and World War II years, and then get into the post-war years from 1946 to 1959 or so, and then get into the tumultuous 1960s and early 70s, and then wrap up with the late 1970s through the 80s. And then I'll wrap up at the very end and talk about what's happened in the last 30 years or so. So here we go. The introduction. Basically, I don't know if you've been there, but it's worth walking over there if you're in New York City. It's a 5-acre faux medieval village on the far east side of Midtown Manhattan in the lower 40s between 1st and 2nd Avenue. Lots of New Yorkers even haven't been there because it's sort of a cul-de-sac hidden away from Midtown. But it's widely considered the first residential skyscraper complex in the world. It's an arguable claim, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. And the place is way ahead of its time, or it was ahead of its time. We're talking about 90, 95 years ago when it was developed, and it set a pattern for urban residential development in a basically self-sustaining way. Everything you wanted was there, except perhaps a movie theater. You would never have to leave Tudor City if you didn't want to. Here is an image of it, or some of it, running from north to south. East 43rd Street down to East 41st. You don't see some of the other buildings on East 41st, 42nd, and 43rd Street, but you see the lovely East River in the background. Tudor City had a major influence in both architecture and design across the country. It helped usher in the neo-Tudor style in a big way. I think it's an early example of urban renewal. Garden planning, new urbanism, all very trendy concepts right now. This happened again almost a century ago. And it anticipated a newer movement towards more walkable and greener communities. Again, very sort of the day avant-garde, but this happened many decades ago. The man responsible for it all was Fred Fillmore French, and yes, he was related. He was a distant cousin to the 13th president, Millard Fillmore. He was also a distant cousin to Buckminster Fuller. And he had a classic Horatio Alger story. He went from rags to riches. He was born in the Bronx, the son of a cigar maker. He somehow borrowed $500, bought the building where he was living, and he just kept parlaying that into bigger and bigger real estate enterprises to the point where he was already a major figure in New York City real estate, one of the biggest ones when Tudor City came along. He was building mostly Park Avenue apartments, luxury apartments for the wealthy. And he used this very innovative plan called the French Plan after him, in which he was able to raise lots of capital very fast, which was his goal. He just couldn't get enough money from the banks. The mortgages would be too good. He wanted to build his buildings up very quickly. And to do that, he had to go to ordinary folks and borrow money from them as well. I'm going to talk about how he did that. There he is. And if you're ever at Fifth Avenue and 45th Street, you can walk into the Fred French building. It's still there. It's a gorgeous building, both inside and outside. It's really worth going inside and checking it out. That was where he had his offices. So here are some images of the French Plan, and you can see it's basically a pitch for ordinary investors to put $1,000 in or more to buy a share of a particular building. Each building was separately incorporated. And the investor would get a dividend of 6%, which was pretty good at the time and very good now. And that was how we did it. And you can see a stock certificate basically, and you would hold onto that and earn your money back. It was a good deal for everybody. Okay, here we go. Where it is, it's on a area of New York City called Prospect Hill. Way back in the late 1700s, it was a battleground in the Revolutionary War. They uncovered a Hessian sword while they were making Tudor City. You can go see that, I believe, at the Museum City of New York. In the early 19th century, you had some great country estates by the wealthy of the time there. But by the Civil War, it had really fallen into disrepair. A lot of the wealthy folks moved uptown to the Upper East Side. And so you had shacks and farms and goats and squatters and gangs, sort of the Midtown version of the gangs of New York, centered around Corcoran's Roost. He was ahead of the gang there. And here we have an image of 42nd Street and 2nd Avenue in 1861. And my coffee shop that I go to, Ground Central, is right where that house is right now. It's been a good place to invest in. And this is what it looked about 7 years later. After the Civil War, you can see it start getting developed. This is Dutch Hill, 42nd Street between 2nd and 3rd. So right around the corner from Tudor City. By the early 20s, it was not a very desirable place to be. You had the East Side slaughterhouses right there, and you had a power plant, which made it one of the ugliest and smelliest parts of the city. But somebody with vision, and it happened to be an employee of Fred French, said this could be a great place. And he took Fred French down there, and Fred French immediately saw that this was potentially prime riverfront property right on the river there. The Midtown Business District was expanding in the 1920s, a lot of companies opening up, and you had Grand Central Terminal also just a few blocks away. So it all made sense. It was just waiting to happen. Here you can see the slaughterhouses along First Ave and the river, which were there until 1946. So Fred French makes his move. Very discreetly, he and his 75-person salesman go door to door, cash in hand, and started buying up tenements and brownstones on the cheap. These people were very happy to take hard cash and move somewhere else. And he had a big vision for this place. He envisioned a city within a city for middle-class folks who wanted to walk to work to Midtown Manhattan rather than take the subway or commute. Fred French hated subways. He hated automobiles. He loved to walk, and he thought there would be a lot of people like him who would want to do the same thing. And this was a revolutionary concept at the time. Nobody else literally was doing this. So he was way ahead of his time. Here you see one of the tenements that was torn down. This is kind of what they looked like in the early 1920s before French started buying them up. He even had a bigger vision that went beyond just Tudor City. He believed that the traffic problem, believe it or not, it was a problem already in the 1920s with Ford's Model Ts, was getting really bad. It was getting to be a bad place to live. And he wanted to fix that. He wanted to create an entirely new kind of residential development that would make the city much more livable, a place where you could both work and live. And he said, in his words, he said he wanted to rebuild Manhattan, not by individual structures, but by whole neighborhoods. So he had a very grand vision that he would duplicate each time. Tudor City was first, but he saw himself doing it over and over again in different parts of Manhattan. So Prospect Hill is transformed in the mid-1920s. He bought about 100 buildings and immediately knocked them down. Only 4 still exist. I'll show you those. And a new massive housing project starts to rise right along the river there. And he counterintuitively uses Tudor Revival style. I mean, Art Deco was all the rage. Modernism was, of course, all the rage. He instead borrows from 16th century England because he thinks it's going to lend old world elegance, and he directly challenges modernism. He sees it as very familiar and very comfortable for the middle class at that time to use that style, and it succeeds. Here you see some of the tenements being torn down and Tudor City going up in these vintage photos. And here we have the four buildings that survive. The one on the upper left is East 41st. That's still there. And the three sort of row houses on East 43rd remain. Okay, so a dozen buildings are put up between 1926 and 1932. That's a lot of building going on. And again, using his French plan to finance this whole thing. You have Prospect Tower and the Manor in 1926 and 1927, Tudor Tower, the Cloister, and the Hermitage going up between 1927 and 1929, Woodstock Tower and the three H's, Haddon Hall, Hatfield House, and Hartwick going up in 1928 and 1929. And then the Essex House and Windsor Tower, where my place is, in 1929 and 1930. And then it takes about 3 years because of the Depression, the crash, to build the Hotel Tudor. And that's finished in 1932. And that's still there under a different name, of course. Here we have an aerial shot from the mid-30s looking east towards the river. And you can see Tudor City there along the river and the smokestacks from the Con Ed plan on the right and the slaughterhouses on the left. Okay, Fred French did not cut any corners. These buildings were almost virtually the same as his luxury Park Avenue buildings. And he was very aware of that. He wanted to build in architectural elements and community features that would resonate with the with white collar workers. So he used brick, sandstone, limestone in all the buildings for a sense of unity. He put in stained and leaded glass windows and terracotta as ornamentation. He put in wide streets, private parks, which we're going to talk a lot about today, a playground, a school, shops. Some of the bachelor apartments had maid and valet service. And while the exteriors were very old world, the interiors were entirely modern. He had elevators. He had the biggest order of GE electric refrigerators to that point in history. He had garbage chutes and radio outlets. So old world on the outside, very new world on the in. Here we have a shot of the parks. The gazebos are long gone, of course, and the parks have been narrowed, which I'll talk about soon too. There was even a kiddie pool in the playground. This is 1943, and the pool is gone. Okay, Fred French was a very big believer in advertising. He spent a lot of money in the New York Times, in the New Yorker, in Playbill, again, going to the middle class and upper middle class. And key selling points were the time savings that you would have from the suburbs. A lot of folks were leaving the city as more immigrants came into it and heading to Westchester, Jersey, Long Island. He wanted to get back some of these folks and prevent others from not leaving. The place was pretty affordable, $500 a year, not bad. And he talked about how quiet the place was and secluded, but also right near all the action of the big city. You're not far from Broadway, the theater, movie theaters, and restaurants, still true today. He talked about the green spaces and the cool river breezes, which were believed to be very healthful at the time. And I looked at hundreds of these ads, I must say, and in just a few, just 2 or 3, the word restricted came up. That's all it said, very coded. And I can only conclude that meant that African Americans were not allowed to rent there. And I talked to old timers there, and they would never see an African American there up until the 80s. So I think more research needs to go into this part of the story because I didn't find it anywhere in the official documents, and I'd like to know more. I'd like to know if Jewish people were not allowed to rent there. This was not uncommon at the time, of course. Here's just a couple of the ads. I love this one. She's a nice girl, but she commutes. It's talking about a businessman who wants to date this woman, but she comes into the city from Westchester, and that is just not going to work for him. So it's getting folks to live in the city for romance. And here you have this other image, green tree, 3 blocks from Grand Central, which was true. Okay. So we have the market crash in October 1929. There's little initial effect of that crash on Tudor City. The Depression reaches Manhattan later than most other places for various reasons. So rentals remain strong in the early 30s. But after a couple of years, it becomes quite clear that this is going to be here for a while, this Great Depression. So he switches the tone in the advertising to the biggest bang for the buck. It's a value proposition. And luckily, he has 2 giant new buildings that open their doors, the Chrysler Building in 1930 and the Empire State Building in 1931. And he's hoping that those buildings become filled with office workers, and they'll want to walk there from Tudor City, even though the Empire State Building is called the Empty State Building because there aren't a lot of workers there. He's hoping that he gets some of those folks. So rents are slashed through the early 30s. It's not a good time for Tudor City. A lot of vacant apartments as the numbers of the unemployed grow. Now back to the French plan. This is a great plan when the rent roll is coming in, when cash is coming in, you can pay those dividends, but it's a terrible plan when you don't have money coming in. He still owes those 6% dividends that he promised, and he is in big financial trouble because he's got to pay them back and he's got to pay the banks back on the other part of the money that he borrowed on. So he is in deep trouble at this point. Now you might think that he would cut down and offer less services, but instead he paradoxically doubles down on amenities to attract more renters who are living in the burbs. And he puts in an indoor miniature golf course, little putt-putt golf course in Windsor Tower. There was already a golf course outside, a little one, I think the only golf course in Manhattan. And he also adds tennis courts in the early 30s. And here you see the golf courses. There's the one outside in the park, one of the parks, and the little putt-putt in Windsor Tower on level D, I believe. Here are the tennis courts. Katharine Hepburn was a player who walked down from Turtle Bay to play there. You had Bobby Riggs. You had a lot of professional tournaments there at the time, so it was a pretty big deal. In 1936, very unexpectedly, very suddenly, Fred French dies at age 52. The newspapers say it was a heart attack, but everyone I've spoken to who had grandparents at the time and knew Fred French or his family say that it wasn't true. It was that he shot himself in his beloved swimming pool, which was probably true because newspapers often covered up suicides, particularly among the wealthy and prominent people. It was sort of an embarrassment. They wanted to protect the family. So I believe that did happen. Whatever the case, there's no doubt that Fred French was in a huge financial hole because he was not only losing money from Tudor City, but he was also losing even more money from Knickerbocker Village downtown, which he had also developed in the meantime. Okay, it's all too bad for Fred French because by the late 30s, the country and New York are coming out of the Depression, and there's signs of life there. Literally with the annual Tulip Show, which was a very big New York City event that has been forgotten over time, but it was a big deal and a beautiful thing. And leases are way up by the late 1930s. More white collar workers get their jobs back. The country's pulling out of the Depression. So the bad times are over for now. The war in Europe, of course, brings lots of new people to New York City. We have a housing shortage. Corporate America is opening up offices. The military and other government agencies are setting up shop in Manhattan. And being close to Grand Central is a huge bonus. You have lots of people coming through that train station. And you're also not far from Brooklyn Navy Yard, where thousands of Navy personnel were working. So Tudor City is in an ideal place to be right now. So while the war is raging overseas, people are very happy at Tudor City. If you read the in-house newsletter, the Tudor City View, you really wouldn't know a war was going on from what people were doing there. Um, and you have gas and tire rationing in other parts of the Tri-County area, like in Connecticut and Westchester. And if you can't drive, it's not a very good place. So that actually, a lot of those folks actually moved to Tudor City, into the city. They think this is a pretty good place to sit out the war because we can't drive our car. Makes sense. You have a thriving black market in Manhattan. Everybody had a friend of a friend of a friend who could get you whatever you wanted, pretty much. And the nightclubs are packed. Department stores are doing quite the business. Lots of money floating around Manhattan in the early 1940s. And here is an image of, I believe it's the top of Tudor Tower, where you really wouldn't know there's a war going on and people are dying overseas. They're sunbathing there. However, Tudor City residents, like most people across the country, were very involved in war efforts. Lots of stories about people donating clothes or making clothing for relief funds. War bonds and stamps were sold in each of the buildings. There were blood and scrap drives. Each building had at least one air raid warden, and they did do air raids. And there were victory gardens. There was actually a place where people were growing vegetables. So very typical American at the time. Okay, so the war is over, and Tudor City is sort of in its heyday at this point. It's a wonderful place to live. Especially if you're a social person. There are so many clubs. There's the art club and the camera club and the Tudor City Forum, where you could talk about any topic of the day. You had the Tudor City Club to play cards, backgammon, checkers, and canasta on Sunday nights. It's a really great place to live. And just to get a sense of how many people are there, you had about 5,500 residents in the 2,800 apartments in the late 1940s. So about 2 people per apartment, which is really all you'd want in one of these apartments, trust me. Here's an image of the Tudor City Camera Club. They would go out and take pictures and show these pictures. There's an image of an art show that was held in Windsor Tower. They would paint pictures and go to museums and such. Very fun. Okay, 1946, the slaughterhouses are finally cleared. William Zeckendorf had been buying them up one by one. And there's lots of discussion about where the United Nations could be. People are talking about Philadelphia and San Francisco, and William Zeckendorf says, no, I don't think so. It's going to be in Manhattan. So he sells the land at a good price, I think $8 million, to the Rockefeller family who could afford it. And the Rockefeller family, who's on vacation in Mexico at the time, they come home, they discuss it, and the next day they donate it or sell it for $1 for the United Nations to call home right there. And Tudor City, very unexpectedly, very suddenly, who knew this would happen, is right next door to the symbolic capital of the world, which brings lots of changes. First of all, in typical fashion, we have Robert Moses, who takes land, parks part of the parkland away to make a bigger road, Tudor City Place. He steals 22 feet in typical fashion, makes up for some reason to do that. And there's lots of rumors circulating now that Tudor City is just going to be purchased by the UN and residents are going to be thrown out. People are pretty concerned about this. And they're also worried now that the UN is next door, that if there's a bomb attack by the Soviet Union, they are right in the path of that. And if you see how close it is, this is a shot from, I guess, a boat on the East River. You have the United Nations on the left and Tudor City there on the right. So it's extremely close. Okay. Finally, in 1954, they decide to get rid of the tennis courts that were beloved. They put up a new building, the first building to be put up since the original 12 buildings. And these are bigger. These are larger apartments for families. It's the 1950s. It's baby boomers are being born, and this is a great time for Tudor City. The occupancy rate is extremely high, even though you have white flight and people running off to the suburbs. Tudor City is more than holding its own. And here we have two Tudor City Place, the new building, which is only, what, 65 years old. Okay, we're going to get into the 60s here, where it gets really fun. East Midtown was pretty sleepy until the UN came along, but it brings in many more organizations and institutions. It really changes the fabric of the neighborhood. And it also brings in lots of police when somebody like Khrushchev or Castro came to town. So lots of noise that wasn't there before the UN came to town. So Tudor City, which billed itself as a very sort of peaceful, quiet enclave, is much less so at this point. And again, fears start circulating. Now, Ford Foundation builds its beautiful building on East 43rd Street in 1967, and people start thinking that they're going to just take Tudor City and buy it and kick everybody out. And there's also fears that the UN will expand its campus and just annex Tudor City. And UN is actually talking about expanding its campus dramatically, both north and south. So these fears are justified. Instead, something totally different happens. We have Harry Helmsley, who is probably the biggest real estate developer at the time, and he buys Tudor City. And he, not so much interested in Tudor City rent, he really loves these parks. He just sees this as prime property to build one, possibly two huge buildings right in the middle of Tudor City. And this is the beginning of what is a 13-year battle to save these parks. The residents rise up. They love the parks. They don't want to see two giant buildings blocking their view. And local politicians do a great job, including Ed Koch, who was just a local representative at the time. And they block Helmsley from developing parkland. They use all their legal powers that they can. There's a guy named John McKean, who's sort of the hero of the story. He creates the Save the Parks Committee, and he rallies a lot of residents to do whatever they can to block the Helmsley from building on this property. And the City Planning Committee, which is part of the Board of Estimate, does indeed block the building of the high rises for now, and Helmsley's lawyers appeal. Now Helmsley decides that he's going to turn Tudor City into condo. This is pretty early on. He's already done part of that in Parkchester in the Bronx. And he just sees much more money to be made from selling condos, from the rent-controlled and stabilized apartments that are there. And the parks are become endangered again when the Supreme Court of the state overrules the Board of Estimate decision. I go through this in painful detail if you want to read about it in the book. So this is a win for Helmsley. Okay, we're into the late 70s. The legal machinations over the parks continue. It's a different story like every week. And Helmsley actually says, this is crazy. I'm just going to start building because I own this land and it's mine. And there's a great picture in the New York Times. Of course, I couldn't use it because of permissions, but it's sort of like the Tiananmen Square, where you have a resident sort of standing in front of a bulldozer, not allowing it to proceed, and it works. Now Helmsley figures something different. If I can't build on these parks, if the residents just won't let me do it, I'm going to use them as leverage to get something even better. And he eyes the city-owned playground right across First Avenue that's still there. And he wants to make a trade with the city, which the city does not want to do. The city does not want to get into the business of trading land for land. They've never done it. They don't want to do it. And this is where Donald Trump makes a cameo appearance. He's consulted on the matter. He's, of course, Helmsley's real estate rival. And I'll let you read about that in the book. Okay, finally, the battle was resolved in 1983 when the courts finally ruled that the parks are, quote, an essential service for tenants. They are paying rent, and part of the rent that they're paying is for the parks. That's what these courts rule. Hooray. Helmsley is done with Tudor City. In 1985, he sells it to a group planning to convert the buildings to condos. Current renters are offered insider pricing. By the way, there's just a few rent control apartments left in Tudor. So there are actually like 3 in my building. Of the 880 or so apartments, 3 are still rent controlled from these days. And part of the deal is that the parks are open to the public. These were private parks, just like the parks in, you know it, sorry, you'll fix that. There's only one other private park, Gramercy Park, yes. But the deal is that these parks have to be open to the public. So they are open today. Okay, we get up to 1988. Tudor City receives landmark status from the Landmark Preservation Committee. They've been working on it for years. Very competitive, not an easy thing to do, but they finally win that. And just a couple of quotes from that report. It is available online, the whole report, if you want to see it. Significance of Tudor City to the architectural history of New York City is multifaceted. And the complex is a premier example of architectural design sensitive to its physical context. All true. Here is a plaque that designates its historic status. And if you do get down there, and I hope you do, you will just see a wonderland of Tudor and Elizabethan architectural history. You have heraldic designs, you have Henry VII's shields on the roofs, you have swans, you have German shields, you have stag's heads, you have falcons, you have boar's heads, you have griffins, ships, roses, of course, on Tudor Tower for the War of the Roses. It's just wonderful to look at. And here are just a couple of images taken by my good friend, photographer Piero Rebelli. He has lots of great pictures in the book. Some more, the ram's head, the gargoyle, of course. So to wrap up, the story of Tudor City, I think, would be hard to make up if you really try to. And I'm not going to read a lot, but I just wanted to read just one little paragraph from the book, which describes the story in a nutshell. Fred Fillmore French, New York City's real estate boy wonder, which is what he was called, goes from rags to riches to build the largest residential complex in the city to that point in time. After completing one of the earliest examples of urban renewal in the country in the Roaring '20s, French uses the financing plan that he had invented to raise millions of dollars in a very short period of time. The complex, whose architecture recalled that of 16th century England, is an immediate success, but the Great Depression brings his company to the brink of financial ruin. Suddenly, French dies at age 52, and not living to see the heyday of his development during World War II and the post-war years, due to the economic boom and the housing shortage. The United Nations decides to move next door, causing considerable friction, but that is nothing compared to the tumult that takes place a few decades later when the most powerful real estate developer in the city buys the complex. This man, the arch rival of the future president of the United States, who makes a brief appearance in the story, tries to destroy the community's village green, but a hero emerges to save the day. Okay, so what has happened since 1989? The last few decades have been pretty tranquil ones for Tudor City, nothing as dramatic as the story I just told. That's good news. Most of the news is related to the need to conform to regulations that, of course, come with being awarded historic status and having to preserve the almost century-old buildings. The apartments are a lot more expensive than they used to be, I can tell you that, but are still quite a bargain because of the very small square footage. I'm seeing lots of wealthier parents buy starter apartments for their children, and the seclusion and the safety are also key selling points, just as they were 90 years ago. I spoke to a lot of folks there, and the longtime residents tell of its storied past. What I talked about today is more or less the official history, but there's a great unofficial history, an oral history that if I had time, I would write another history of the book that way. And this is more about how the place was a red light district in World War II and the post-war years. It was well known. If you pulled into Grand Central Station in the 1940s and you asked a cab driver where to get some action, he would take you right to Tudor City because it was cheap. You didn't need a lot of space for what people wanted to do there. And that's a great part of the story that I'd love to know more about. It was also a haven for Midtown businessmen's mistresses in the 50s and 60s. So if you've seen The Apartment, the movie, the wonderful Billy Wilder movie, that could have been shot right there. A lot of business folks ensconced their girlfriends in a cheap Tudor City Tudor City apartment before they went home to the burbs and saw their wives and families. Lots of eccentric characters through the years, not surprising, because if you weren't crazy before you moved into such a small apartment, you probably would become that way. And of course, the ghost walking the hallways has to be part of the story. And I spoke to a lot of old timers who have seen ghosts or claim to. Okay, so even if you have not been there, even if it's a secret to many folks, you might have seen it in movies, because there seems to be always a movie or a TV show being shot there because of its beauty. Scenes from Bullets Over Broadway, the Woody Allen movie, Godfather Part 3, Scarface, Peacemaker, The Bourne Ultimatum. The 3 Spider-Man movies were filmed on the wonderful penthouse in Windsor Tower. So you might have seen it even if you haven't gotten over there, but please do. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm open to questions.